When you hear the words free speech, what comes to mind? Maybe it's the Constitution. Maybe it's the ongoing conversations about who gets to say what and when. For me, it's the idea of free. Because as we've all heard before, freedom is not free. Today I'll be presenting on the free speech movement, which took place between the years of 1964 and 1965 on the campus of the University of California, Berkeley. I'd like to start my presentation with a video.
The summer of '64 was Mississippi Freedom Summer.
The air was crackling, really, with these ideas.
At the end of the summer, I drove out to Berkeley. Right at the entrance to the university along Bancroft Avenue, there were all of these tables from all these different political and some social organizations. And the very next day, the dean of students says all those tables have to go.
The idea that the university could come out with regulations prohibiting civil rights activity when people were dying in the South. So we were outraged.
Some of the organizations that had been affected by this set up a picket line. Civil rights people, Goldwater Republicans, Ayn Rand objectivists. It had put democracy above ideology.
We organized petitions. We went as supplicants. We sent delegates to talk to administrators, to deans, to the chancellors. We were building this step by step. It wasn't like, oh, they won't let us. Well, now we're going to tear down the university.
They tried to arrest a former graduate student who was sitting at a table in front of Sproul Hall, and they brought a police car on campus.
And we all ran down there and sat around the car, and the car became the dais atop of which people then addressed the crowd.
Anybody could get up there who wanted to talk, and people got up to support the action, people got up to argue against the action, to support civil disobedience, to argue that we should be obeying the law. It was extremely emotional. What can I say? It committed you.
We had the big rally on December 4th, and Mario spoke, and Joan Baez had come, the folk singer had come and sang, and to her singing and playing, we all marched in to Sproul Hall. And that began the sit-in that went all night.
One of the things that we had been considering was whether or not we were going to call a strike. But as soon as the administration called in the police and began dragging students out of, in the middle of the night, we all just went on strike. And it was enormously effective.
At that point, we had morally won. And then a couple of days later, the faculty voted to support totally the FSM position that the university could not limit the content, make no regulations restricting the content of speech or advocacy. And at that point, we had won.
It opened up our minds to the possibilities that you could organize. You could pull people together around a cause. And, you enter this whole period of all the different liberation movements and all of the, and in that sense, I think it had a terrific legacy.
I hope you found that video to be helpful and informative. But to truly understand the context of what was happening, you need to understand what was going on more broadly in the country. I want to talk a little bit about the context that this change movement occurred in. So it was in 1964 to 1965. It was around the same time as the civil rights movement And as the country was coming out of the Red Scare of the 1950s, where people were being questioned by the FBI for potential ties to communism. And so all of this led to this overarching feeling that the government was kind of impeding on the rights of people in ways that were unjust. And as people became aware of these things, they wanted to challenge them. It's also important to note that this occurrence, so the period I'm talking about is between 1964 and 1965, but this was not the start of this movement. What we saw there was a capitalization on the momentum that they had already been building. A few of the change members, of the leaders of the organization or the group that was running the change, were also a part of a group on campus that was known as Slate. And these had been students who were pushing the institution to do better for the students, and they had ideas. Now, the administration of the university had not been receptive at first. And in fact, one of the administrators of the institution said that it's an illusion that freshmen come in and they have all these demands and that they have to pretend, they being the administration and the institution has to pretend that these demands are unique. But what he did not know is that because this was all happening at the same time as a number of other important societal shifts, this time was different. It was very different. And the consequences and the outcomes were unique to this situation.
When the free speech movement kicked off in the fall of 1964, the university didn't understand that something major had shifted. The students weren't just angry, they were organized.
This level of organization, which I will analyze now using the Change Leadership Framework, is precisely what made their movement so successful. So next, I want to talk a little bit about the Change Leadership Framework. We can look at the Change Leadership Framework in 4 steps. The first step is the groundwork step. Second step is the blueprint step. The third step is the campaign step. And the fourth step is the resolution step. So looking first at the groundwork step, I just want to kind of reiterate that we're looking at a very specific period in this movement. So the free speech movement, we can understand it as starting way before when it kind of heated up in 1964 and 1965 on the campus of UC Berkeley. So, on one hand, one of the key elements of the groundwork step is to identify the root problem. So, on one hand, that work was being done by people who would eventually go on to lead the movement on the UC Berkeley campus. But on the other hand, the action that we saw in UC Berkeley was kind of reactionary. It was kind of like the institution had taken very specific steps that were a blatant attack on free speech. They weren't allowing people to pass out pamphlets or for causes that they didn't support, such as the civil rights movement. And that was seen as dangerous to many students. And so they felt like they had to react. In addition, they had dragged the student out and had him in the police car, and that acted as a catalyst for change as well. And so from those points, you saw the university taking a bunch of actions that actually helped the movement gain traction. And I want to point out that also in the groundwork stage, there is a place for prepare for opposition and resistance. And so, again, this is a unique situation because the movement was escalated by the opposition and resistance. And so I'm not sure how they tried to anticipate what the administration would do. But what I am sure about is that they use those actions conducted by the administration as a point of unity for the movement overall. Now, the next step I want to talk about is the blueprint phase. And in the blueprint phase, you're looking to form a leadership team, to build a brand and a base of support, and to develop the learning capability and strategic capacity of the team. So the blueprint phase is unique for this movement as well because there were leaders in the student, like there were leaders in the group slate that had been elected, that had been fighting for causes that they believed in long before this event even came to the forefront on campus. Um, but then there were also just alliances that they made, and they made a very conscious decision to work with people who they might not have agreed with on every other issue, but they said, let's focus on the things that we agree on because together we can get more done. And so they really looked to make a good, strong alliance and connect with people in order to get their goals achieved. Building the brand is also very interesting because I think they benefited a lot from the opposition. I think the university's actions, the government's actions, they were all they were all forcing people to take a stronger stance because they were just so aggressive, and there was just a wave of backlash that naturally happens uh, after these aggressive acts. And again, as it's important to remember the time in history where people were coming out of the Red Scare and really starting to challenge the way the government was treating the citizens. And so it was kind of like this perfect storm, but they were able to build their brand based on the idea that they were the real patriots, that they were trying to protect American ideas, not the American government, not UC Berkeley, but the actual students who were fighting against these unjust rules. And so in that regard, they were very successful at building a brand. Now, the next stage I want to talk a little bit about is the campaign stage. And so this is about building awareness, this is about building engagement, this is about, really focusing on leveraging that tension to further your movement. It's also about mobilizing for action and generating energy, momentum, and commitment. And then finally, it's about heightening that engagement, leveraging that power, and escalating the pressure until the change is achieved. Now, the movement, in my opinion, was very successful at this phase, at the campaign phase, because they got demands. If you listen to that video, they said we won. Like they got what they wanted. And that was very powerful because they were able to use those wins to generate momentum. And in this time period there were just constant examples of winning after winning after winning and so what they were able to do by using that win was to give other people hope and give them a blueprint that they could follow for taking direct action, for pushing back, for advocating for what you believe in a way that wasn't previously accessible for them. Like you have to note that like this was the generation coming after the silent generation. So it was silent generation, silent no more. And then the final stage is the resolution stage. So this is about measuring, assessing, sustaining the change with new habits and frames. It's also about celebrating and learning from successes and building on losses to bounce back. Now the resolution stage is the most difficult for me to understand in this context, because by most standards, the movement was successful. And so if you were looking back to evaluate whether or not the movement worked, most people would say, yes, they accomplished their goal. This movement was successful. But I think it's also particularly interesting to think about this movement in terms of what it meant for free speech for years to come in this country. Because some might argue that there was a turning point. That was a turning point. But if you look at the debates about free speech that are happening right now in our country, they look very different from the free speech debates that they were having. And so it makes you wonder, like, if there was some kind of way that they could have secured a lasting legacy for this movement, and so that it wouldn't be hijacked by people who who claim to act in the name of free speech, but instead are actually trying to justify saying some very objectionable things. And so, on one hand, a free speech advocate might say, I might disagree with what you're saying, but I'll fight for your right to say it. And on the other they might say that there is no space for these kind of things when you're trying to create an inclusive environment. And let's be clear about free speech. What we mean when we say free speech. So free speech means freedom to say what you want without fear of being persecuted by the government as a result of that. And so that doesn't mean there's no consequences. That just means that the government doesn't take you away for saying something that it disagrees with. I also want to note that after the free speech movement, there was a lot of political unrest, and the pendulum, as to give a metaphor, the pendulum, some might say, swung in the other direction. And when I say that the pendulum swung in the other direction, what I'm talking about is that right after this, we saw the election of Ronald Reagan as governor of California, who ran on large part on the platform of cleaning up Berkeley. And so some might argue that he used this as a stepping stone and that people were so fed up because of what they saw happening in the movement, what they interpreted as being chaotic, that it led directly to the election of someone who opposed the movement, who opposed what was going on in Berkeley, who did not support the students, and in fact ran a whole campaign in opposition to the students. As I get ready to conclude this video, I do want to call out just a few more things, and this will largely be my own opinion about the movement. So, firstly, I want to say I think that the movement deserves a lot of credit because this was one of the first times in the country's history where you saw the disobedient tactics of the civil rights movement used on a college student driven or on a college campus driven largely by college students. And it was immensely successful and gave them a lot of leverage and a lot of opportunity to negotiate with the campus. And they were very successful in getting their demands met by the institution and by the administration. I also think this point in history, this movement laid the groundwork for a lot of other movements that would be led by college students in the country. So we owe a huge debt of gratitude to these students for standing up for free speech. One thing that weighs heavily on my heart, however, is the free speech, as I mentioned before, the free speech debate now looks so different from the debate that they were having. And I am most perplexed by especially seeing Ronald Reagan become the governor of California right after this movement. And you might expect to see a resurgence of the free speech movement as a result, but instead, Ronald Reagan was able to own the narrative and make it seem as if what they were fighting for was just chaos. And one of the things that was powerful about the movement's brand was that they had initially painted themselves as the true patriots, as the people who were fighting for the American ideas when the American government itself was not holding up its end. And so if I had to critique this movement, if I had to pick something that I feel like could have been improved, it would have been having a strategy, a long term strategy for dealing with the backlash, especially the wave that came right after their movement. Um, because I feel like that kind of backlash actually hurt their demands in the long term. It may have even set them back more than they were before. And I say that because they were made to look like a chaotic, disorderly group of just wild kids, essentially, when in reality, they were very organized. And what they were fighting for made a lot of sense to a lot of people. And because they were not able to sustain that and to maintain ownership of their own brand and identity, I believe that was taken from them. To wrap this presentation up, I just want to summarize what I've been talking about and to a few tangible key takeaways. The first one is do not miss your shot. So, as I discussed throughout this presentation, the intervention that we saw was really a culmination of a lot of organizing and planning, before it got to the chance. And so they were able to capitalize on this movement in the moment and not miss their shot. And I thought that was very important to the success of their movement. The second thing is, don't be afraid to use your opposition's words or actions against them. And this is particularly important when your opponent purports to follow or subscribe to a certain set of values or beliefs, and they aren't living up to them. And the movement did this very effectively by painting themselves as patriots fighting for free speech, which was supposed to be an American right. And then the third thing I would say is just build coalitions. So this movement took place during a time where a lot of different protests and other movements were happening, and they were able to unify around this idea of free speech, which was mutually beneficial for all of the members of the coalition. The two things I would say, just thinking about change movements going forward, is to always try to find ways to sustain your victory beyond the current battle, because your success is more meaningful if it's long term and if it has a substantial impact on the society, on the greater society for longer periods. And you don't want to see a situation where you make some success, you take a step forward, and then you take 2 steps backwards. And then the final thing I would say is just be clear about how you're going to evaluate your movement and what actual success looks like beyond small victories, and then tie that into your vision, because they had a lot of people behind their movement and they could have used that to make something even more powerful, even more influential, that sustained over a long period of time. This book, The Closing of the American Mind by Alan Bloom, is one way to look at the free speech debate, but it feels very different from the free speech movement of the 60s. I'd like to leave you with a few thought-provoking questions. The first one being, how has the free speech movement evolved, and what does free speech challenges look like today? The second being, how would the free speech movement of the 60s look like if they had tools such as social media available to help them further their cause? I just want to thank you for joining me today. I hope you have enjoyed, found the content interesting, and learned something. Have a good summer.